Professor of Natural Sciences at Edith Cowan University, and he's really passionate about wetlands ecology. He lectures in sustainable water management, as well as being recognised for excellence in postgraduate supervision, and he's actually examined 16 PhDs in the last 12 years, so on top of lecturing and everything else he does. So Pierre will share with us his perspective from a scientist and researcher on exactly what this biodiversity law will mean for our wetlands and aquatic biota, and exactly how not just the biodiversity of the wildlife, but also those processes that really underpin our biodiversity. So, welcome.
Thanks, Timothy. I'd like to pay my respects to the Nina elders, past and present, and also, actually, to all elders, past and present, for the enormous reservoir of knowledge that exists in this state. I wanted to start by reflecting on Nyunga Puja because what it seems, one of the things that seems to be going on with the legislation, but also our approach to the environment in Western Australia, I don't think it's just exclusive to Western Australia, I think it's also Australia, is that we make these arbitrary divisions and boundaries between things, and in the concept of country and Buddha, you know, there's a oneness about that, and I respect that oneness so much because it allows us to see that we're part of a connected whole, instead of the divisions between, for example, land and water, or the divisions between flora and fauna, and the separation between the ocean and the land, and the water that's in the ocean and the water that's on land. I mean, these are arbitrary decisions, but they're perpetuated through the legislation that we're given, and that means that they're perpetuated in the way that we have to think and respond to them. And it's also a question about language. So anyway, there's a little snapshot of where how I'm going to approach the next. Are we down to 8 minutes now? And I'm going to reiterate some of the things that we've already talked about. And the first thing that I'm going to reiterate is the first object of the bill, to conserve and protect biodiversity and biological components in the state. And if we said that, wouldn't we expect that this act or this bill would encompass all of the biological components? You would hope that it would. And wouldn't we expect also that all of those biological components would be subject to the same sorts of provisions and the same sorts of languages and the same sorts of statutes, and in an uncomplicated way? Now, I have in some ways set up a straw man. You probably recognise that. Because what I have to do now is actually talk about two new pieces of legislation. They've already been introduced to you, because all flora and fauna is not flora and fauna, according to the legislation that we have. So I'm going to talk about the Biodiversity Conservation Bill, but I have to also talk about the Aquatic Resources Management Bill, and they were both introduced into Parliament last year, and awaiting further readings as far as I can understand. One of the reasons for that is that biological components are the way they've defined biological components, and by the way, they've got in the definitions in this Biodiversity Conservation Bill. That's a funny sort of I'll just remove that. But it's biodiversity components. It's in the object says biological components. It's being a little bit picky, but in the definitions it's biodiversity components. But it's all predicated on this. The hook in here is a native species. And a native species can either be a plant or an animal. If it's a plant, it's flora. If it's an animal, it's fauna. And then the rest of the Act talks about fauna or flora. It also gives provisions. There's a section which you can't see there, section 9, which allows a decision to be made about something that is not an animal that is not fauna, or a plant that is not flora, and that's for reasons that I don't quite understand, but the example that's given in the explanatory memorandum is something like a dingo. So a minister can declare something like a dingo that might be perceived as a pest as not an animal. So that's just one thing that you need to keep in the back of your mind. And the other thing is that section 12 is the section that says, and I'm going to have to find this in my notes because I have to read it out to you because it's quite important. Section 12 is the bit that defines this Act, other than Part 9, which is about not fauna or not flora, does not apply to or in relation to any fish or pearl oyster that is the subject of aquaculture, commercial fishing, recreational fishing, hatchery activities or pearling. So it's true that fauna and flora can be fish, and if they are subject to aquaculture, commercial fishing, recreational fishing, hatchery activities or pearling. And if that's the case, if they are subject to any of those things, then the other piece of legislation comes into force. So the question then is, well, what if they're not subject to those things? Are they still fauna and flora for the purposes of the Biodiversity Conservation Bill? Well, you'd like to think so, but it's incredibly murky in there. It's very difficult to tell. So it's not entirely true to say that the Biodiversity Conservation Bill excludes fish. It says that if flora or fauna are part of this suite of activities, then it excludes them. There are also some tricky little things in there. So there's a whole division in there, or a subdivision, I don't know, I can't remember quite which, I should. But about where it talks about fauna, or it talks about flora without excluding fish. So it's really quite cumbersome, at least in terms of the Act. So this is what we have to now look at. We have to look at what's now called the Fish Resources Management Act and what will be called the Aquatic Resources Management Act. Aquatic means anything to do with water, so that means ocean and rivers and lakes and streams and wetlands in general. And fish means anything. Basically, it means anything to do with aquatic organisms, and including, by the way, live rock, so including rock that might have organisms within it, or sand that might have organisms in it. So and including plants. I'm not kidding about that. It includes seeds and spores, and it includes plants that are aquatic, are called fish. So that's in that particular Act. It's just madness in some ways, but at least we'll bear with them, because what they've done in this new piece of legislation, the Aquatic Resources Management Act, is to change fish to aquatic resources. So there's a little one that we have to get our heads around as well. So if it's an aquatic resource, then it comes under this definition now. It's not fish. So it's a little bit clearer. But that doesn't include, so this is about what gets included and doesn't get included that is then not included again, or something like that. But it doesn't include an aquatic mammal, an aquatic reptile, an aquatic bird, or an aquatic amphibian. They are not fish. They're actually fauna. So they are included. So there are aquatic animals that are included directly in the Biodiversity Conservation Act, and that's by exclusion from the Fisheries Resource Management Act, and it'll be the same for the Aquatic Resources Management Act. So we have to do those sorts of amendments. And I'm sorry, but it's okay. So the Aquatic Resource Management Act there like the Biodiversity Conservation Bill. There are some things that are worth looking at and worth pursuing, because they make some good points. One of them is section 117, which creates aquatic habitat protection areas, and the minister may set aside these. May is the conditional clause that we're also concerned about. because it's discretionary, but the minister can do it. It can set aside aquatic habitat protection areas for the protection of aquatic organisms and so on. And one of the issues here is that there's no explicit mention of wetlands, and there's no explicit mention of international agreements to do with wetlands. So it goes the good step of saying, well, you can create an aquatic habitat protection area, but it doesn't recognise this whole suite of activity that belongs to aquatic habitat protection areas that belongs to another part of our jurisdictional domain. So there's a really a messy situation in there as well. Oh, and by the way, that's section 117, but before that comes a really interesting 116, this will make your hair stand on end, application of division to other acts. Nothing in this division affects or is to be seen to derogate from, in other words, diminish, the operation of the Mining Act, the Offshore Minerals Act, Petroleum and Geothermal Energy Resource Act, the Petroleum Submerged Lands Act, any other act related to minerals or petroleum, or any government agreement as defined in the Government Agreement Act. So, good luck to you. Now, there is one, just a little bit more on the Aquatic Resources Management Bill, 2015. One of the good things, and the EGO pointed this out in their white paper, was that the minister must ensure that the condition of aquatic resources and the aquatic environment is kept constantly under consideration. It is quite a powerful tool, this to compel the minister to monitor at least, and then that if something is shown to be the case, here comes the non-mandatory component about it, that the minister is of the opinion to do something about it, to do a risk assessment. The point about this is that it's the Minister for Fisheries' responsibility for aquatic habitats. This says clearly to me that it's the Minister for Fisheries who needs to pay attention to aquatic habitats. And that's in general. So if there's this arbitrary decision between water and land, aquatic habitats, and that's whether they're oceanic, coastal, or inland, it seems to me, that the Minister for Fisheries, it's implied here, in my reading of this, that it's the Minister for Fisheries who has primary responsibility for aquatic habitats. That's certainly not the case if you look at the Biodiversity Conservation Bill. So just to quickly run through some components of the Biodiversity Conservation Bill, the Minister may, by order, list a native species, especially protected species, and some important ones here, that the setting's gone all over the place, but the migratory species and those species that are covered by international agreements like the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species, the Migratory Bird Agreements, they're all allowable under the Biodiversity Conservation Bill. There's a slight problem here in that the only way the Ramsar Convention is acknowledged in the Biodiversity Conservation Bill is on Schedule 1 of the Regulation Orders and Guidelines, which is Part 14, which says matters for which regulations may be made the conservation, protection and management of, for example, Ramsar wetlands. So for Ramsar wetlands, these are the jewels in the wetland crown are still discretionary in terms of the Act. So I was hoping that this would come out, and it has, except for the colour. But my summation of the situation is that you've got two bills. You've got some the way they deal with threatened species, threatened communities, critical habitat, threatening processes, monitoring, recovery, and whether they take scientific advice or have advisory bodies. You see that those two bills they're really all over the place. They don't sing from the same hymn sheet, if you like. So in some cases, and most of the time, they're discretionary on the minister, a point that's been made time and again. So, for example, the Biodiversity Conservation Bill, the minister may obtain advice from any person considered by the minister to have expertise relevant to the manner in which a decision relates. So the phrase scientific advice doesn't appear in the bill. Isn't that extraordinary? But on the other hand, advisory committees are well and truly entrenched in the Aquatic Resources Management Bill. I mean, these things that don't overlap are bizarre. Threatened communities are covered by the Biodiversity and Conservation Bill, discretionary, yes, but at least they're covered. But they don't seem to be covered in the Aquatic Resources Management Act, or at least not in that phraseology. Monitoring is not, the word isn't used in the Biodiversity Conservation Bill. So there's no, the minister doesn't even have to think about it, let alone being mandated to do it. Threatening processes are covered in both bills. The Aquatic Resources Management Bill deals with declared organisms, and quite importantly that it does that, and it also deals with pollution, but it's discretionary, and so on. So anyway, there's a little snapshot. So my sense is that for some things, having a discretionary act, if you have a really good minister, it could be fantastic. But what are the chances of getting a really good minister? I think my major concern is where the threatening processes are related to the activities of government and industry, and where it's very difficult to pull apart societal actions from government policies. Things like prescription burning and things like the over-extraction of groundwater. These are really difficult things, and they are they're the things that are causing so much angst to wetland ecologists. That you can't see a way through the mire in terms of those things through these two pieces of legislation at least. So for aquatic matters, there is some clarity. The definition of fish is clear. Where they're targeted as resources is clear. They come under another piece of legislation, but you would hope that both pieces of legislation would use the same language and would cover the same sorts of things. Aquatic organisms that aren't mammals, where they're not the subject for taking or other directly exploitative interventions is problematic. Who's responsible is problematic. Where it appears that all fauna and flora of fish are excluded from protection is problematic. Discretionary powers are problematic. The lack of formal scientific advice is problematic. And I'm going to have to squirrel my way through the notes to find the last one. The mismatch between the state and the Commonwealth commitments is problematic. And wetland ecosystems, including those of international and national significance, the fact that they seem to be avoided in both acts is problematic as well. So I'll get out of your way, sorry.